So welcome to the last session of the day. I'm very grateful that you decided to spend so late in the day talking about something as maybe a little bit dry as governance, which is what I'm going to talk about. But I'm grateful that you decided to spend the time. Have you had a good time so far? Yeah. We're going to drink some beers tonight, yeah? Yeah, good. So, yeah. Before we go further, my Twitter wants to be part of it. You've heard this a million times today, but I'm also a conference organizer. Hi. So I know how important it is that sponsors, they are what makes this conference free. So go on, give them some love. Just go on and say hi. They might even have something that you need. Could be. So it's always good to give them value for money, because if they don't get value for money, next year they won't sponsor, next year it's not going to be free, all those kind of things. Okay, that's it. My name is Ásgeir Gunnarsson. The weird name is because I'm Icelandic. I do live in Denmark and have a consultancy there called North Insights. Been in BI for many, many years. I co-wrote a book on Power BI administration and governance called Pro Power BI Administration. Even though it's just called administration, it's still half governance, half administration. I wrote it together with a fellow data platform MEP called Michael Johnson from South Africa. You can get it in all good bookstores. You will get those slides here, so you will have my contact information if you want to get in touch, if you have any question, or if you just want to link on Twitter or something like that. Twitter is probably the easiest way to get in touch with me. Emails, I will answer them eventually, but I get a lot of them. So, is your Power BI environment in the Wild West? I get this a lot when I go to customers and they think, my Power BI environment is all out of control. But usually it isn't out of control. It's just they don't know. But sometimes it is. And even if it is or it isn't, welcome. I got it work. Thank you for the consideration. But I got it last minute. So no matter if it is out of control or is it in the Wild West or not, there are basically two things you need to be asking yourself if you want to know what's going on. How do I want my Power BI environment to be? How is my Power BI environment? I know these are pretty broad questions, but these are basically the things you need to be asking yourself. And they usually hang together with each other. So knowing how you want your Power BI environment to be, but not how it is kind of useless. Knowing how it is, but not how you want it to be, is partially valuable. At least you can understand if you have, maybe a breach or something like that. But if you know both of these things, that's where you get real value. That's where you are properly in control. So, how do you do that? And why are you doing governance? So, this is a really long text. I'm not going to read it for you because this is just for your benefit when you get the slides. But there are two parts of one part of each sentence that I think is really good when you think about governance. So, when you think about governance, it's the need to make sure that users, no matter if they're creators or administrators or whoever it is, they know how to use, manage, and secure all the artifacts. That's what you would get out of it. They know what they're doing. But it's also vital that the governance is implemented early. It's never too late. But it's best, the earlier you do it, the better it is. But also in such a way it does not impede creators and users unless necessary. So you have to think about it in a way that, yes, we're going to put some rules in place, but there's a reason for it. There is something, I can argue why I put it in place. It's not just because we hate you. It is actually because there is a security risk or there's something in place there. So that's why I think it's important not just to fall back on existing strategies for some completely different areas. You have to be, have to understand that Power BI can be different than other places, and depending a little bit how you use it, of course. So if you start at the top, if you start by thinking, okay, I need a governance strategy. What should you be thinking when you do the governance strategy? So within the governance strategy, there are multiple things. Multiple ways to do it, and I'm going to come to more specifically how to do those things. But if you just start thinking about the strategy itself, when you start writing it, you should think about things like, is a Power BI an enterprise BI tool in your organization, or is it maybe a self-service maybe in a managed self-service, which is very popular, or is it all of the above? The larger the organization, the more often you get all of the above. You might have IT department doing proper enterprise. You might have some parts of the organization doing managed self-service, so you take care of them, but they can do some things by themselves. And you might have even in other parts of the organization they can do whatever they want. Maybe in a shared capacity, while everyone else is in premium capacity or something like that. So you might have different ways to do it. Depending on what you pick out of these, it impacts your complexity of your governance strategy a lot. Other considerations you need to think about, of course, how sensitive is your data, how experienced are your developers. That has a big impact on how thorough governance strategy you can do. How do they work with Power BI? What kind of security standards are you under as an organization? So you might work in an industry, a financial industry, or healthcare industry, or something where you have external things that say how you should govern your Power BI environment. And how much of an audit trail do you require? Because in some industries you need a lot, and others you don't need a lot. Keep that in mind. But what I always say is, when you start doing your strategy, the key things you need to be thinking about, first of all, you need management buy-in. If you don't have management buy-in, nobody wants to pay for things that is not, many people feel that this work here, and it's quite a bit of work, writing a bunch of documents and doing all kind of things, and some of you might think it's going to impede my work. So why would we secure funding for that? So you need management buy-in. It's very similar to, I don't know if anyone here were in Craig's session on data governance. It's unsexy topics, but if you need top-level management buy-in for it to get funding basically. And you should always be thinking about how much control is enough. Don't go over that line. Because Power BI is in a way such a self-service centric tool, you don't want to be putting things on that are not necessary. No, like rules. How do you document those controls? So if you're doing your governance strategy and you want something specific to happen, how do you document it so everyone understands it, and how do you enforce it? I'm not going to talk a lot about enforcement here, but that's one of the most difficult things about doing governance, because you might understand how you want it to be, you might even understand how it is, but how do you then enforce people to do things correctly? That can be a very difficult thing, but if with the right management buy-in, you can do it. And I think actually in Benny's session today it was a really good. It's a good way he worded it. It's about enablement. It's not about hindrance. So you should always try to approach people when you're doing enforcement in the ways that we are only trying to help you. We are not trying to impede you, but that's not always easy. And make it available, because what I see sometimes, I've been to a couple of customers that have actually had an okay governance in place, but nobody just knew about it. It was just laying somewhere, and they had created it. They couldn't, they had users all over the place, and people didn't know where it was, and so few people knew it well, but other people didn't know. So make sure everyone knows it, and preferably with automatic delivery. So that, I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, you want people to receive the documents when they need them. You don't want them to have to look for them themselves. And I always recommend to put up a RASI, which is responsible, accountable, communicated, and informed. It's basically a matrix of people that are, have some responsibility and accountability in your governance strategy. Because if nobody's accountable, nobody's going to follow it. Nobody's going to. So these people need to be with some weight behind them. They need to be able to enforce things. And because if they don't, then like I say, it's very hard to tell people to do something if there's no consequences and really nobody does anything about it. You can, and I think you should, have a governance strategy as a separate document. So this is my strategy. And then you have a bunch of other documents that are, I will come to later. But you can also embed it into your processes. It is a little bit easier to communicate in that way. because people will often read the process because they have to, but the strategy might be a little bit above their head. But I still think separate governance documents, strategy documents, is best way. And when you do such things, when we start thinking about more specifics, when you come down to it, I really like the approach of having it as a best practices, because processes have a little bit of bad name, but also just to you have a guideline. You're trying to tell people how to make people's life easier. You're not trying to enforce them to do something they don't want to do. Okay, enough about governance strategy. In my world and in my way, then a governance strategy has 4 pillars. It works on. It has processes, it has training, it has monitoring, and it has roles. They're very, it's very different how heavy each one of them is, if I can use those words, because processing and monitoring is going to be the central part, but training and roles are still important, and they allow you to do things correctly in a very obvious manner, I would say. But I'm going to go into each one of these. Good time, yes. So processes first. Why do we want to have processes? Because if you have a process, you reduce risk by making sure people do things correctly. You standardize the way it's done, which is also something that reduces risk, but it also just makes things easier to work with. It's the efficiency thing. And more efficient developers and administrators because they do things correctly the first time, instead of, and also doing things right first time is something that will also reduce risk, of course. So a process is a backbone of a good governance strategy. It should probably be broken into smaller processes. You will probably not going to have one Power BI process, because that just doesn't make any sense. You often have people in different roles, even though they're creating content, they might be in many different roles. So you want to probably break it down to smaller processes. And the main, the main thing about the process is to reduce risk. If you think about it, if you work in an environment where you are afraid of breaches, data breaches or some kind of breaches, when it comes to Power BI, most of them that we hear in the world are accidental. So of course, hackers is something that can happen, but when it comes to Power BI, most breaches are accidental. And if you have a good process in place, you reduce a lot the likelihood of an accidental breach. And I say it can be presented as best practices if your organization has, if you're an SAP organization, many people hate processes because they are long and they are, standardized in such a way that only 5% of them is good, has good content. Don't go down that route. Don't copy those kind of processes and just start using those templates. Write your own templates for Power BI processes and keep them concise and keep them on point. And I really like when you're writing a process that you start by saying, these are our guiding lights. These are the 4 points that you have to get out of this process, and then you do the details. That's how I would like to do them. So first one that I like to point out is the development process. This is probably the most important one. Well, there is another one that comes after this, which is maybe equally important, but this one is really important. And a development process, as the way I see it, will often include things such as, where do I do my development? Do I do it in the service or do it in Power BI Desktop? What kind of objects am I working with? Do I only do Power BI reports and data sets, or do I do page reports or data flows and all these different things? You outline that in your development process, and then you show how to, where to do each development. Then you also say how and where to store the Power BI Desktop files. Should it be on the C drive? Should it be in some kind of version control system? Because this one is something that I see everywhere I go. People have no idea. A business developer just saves it on the desktop because that's where they do things, and that's both a security risk, but it's also just a support risk. Because if they leave the company, that might go with them. There are all kind of different things that could be gained from that. When to split the report and data set, and this is not a full list of everything, but these are the things that I generally have as my first bullet points. how to do branding. Where do I store my JSON file with my color information? Where do I have, if I have backgrounds that are corporate-wide, where do I store them? All these different things. And then some support material that might, you might have some training material or something like that. And often you will split this process into two different processes, one for those professionals and one for those who are business developers. And the reason why you would do that is that the professionals, you can put much more requirements on them. You can say, you need to save it as a template file and put it into Git. Well, that's not really likely that a business developer will do something like that. So you might not, but I will very often split this up into two professional and non-professional publishing and sharing, which is the next one. They are often in one process, but they might also be in two separate processes depending on how you do things. If you're in a highly managed environment where a user will publish to dev, maybe test, but then a process will take over, then you don't need those people that are doing the development and publishing from Power BI Desktop. You don't need to have give them a sharing process, because they're not going to do that anyway. There's some kind of managed process behind it. But if that's the same person who does both things, then you might often put them together. So publishing process will often say, how do I set up or request a workspace? Because it's not automatically that you know it. You will try to press the create button, and in many organizations you cannot. So it's best to inform them beforehand, this is the way you request it, this is the information we need before you do it. And of course, how then and when to publish. Do I just publish the dev and then some process takes over, or do I do everything myself? The sharing process, pretty much the same thing. So it's like when you have published it, how do you share it? So how do you share it to people? There are multiple ways to share things in Power BI, and if you allow the users to do sharing themselves, they often get very confused. Should I do direct sharing? Should I give people access to my workspace? Should I use apps? Having that outlined properly will help them a lot. And I say, where I have done this for organizations, they are very grateful people. They're not like, oh, please don't give me process. They're just very grateful to do things correctly the first time. And security process normally will split up in two things: securing objects and securing data. Securing objects is more about like, how do I store my Power BI Desktop file? How do I give access to my workspaces and to all these different artifacts that are there? It's very similar to the sharing process, but the sharing process will probably just refer to this one about the actual levels of access you should be giving. So should it be an admin or a member or a contributor or all these different things. And then the data security process will talk about how to do role-level security. It will also talk about what data sources, if any, in the organization allow for a pass-through security. And when you talk about role-level security, you will most likely have some material that will tell them how to do that, or who they should talk to at least if they want to do something like that, both in a dynamic and a static way. You want to have a naming standard process, and this is probably one of the hardest things that I've ever created. It's never the same, never ever the same. And everyone has an idea of how things should be named, but it's incredibly hard to do it properly. Especially if you do a generic process that will work for everyone. It can be really hard, but I highly recommend that you do it. Spend some time on it. It will just tell you how things should be named. And don't go too granular, because I have a customer that's gone all the way down to a report level. How you should name reports. And that is really, really, really hard to do that generally. So I don't recommend it, but it can be done. A support process, and the reason why I have a support process is that most organizations I work with, they have some kind of a support organization, so help desk. Those help desk people have no idea what Power BI is normally. They don't know nothing about Power BI, and what I found is in many cases they will just receive tickets and they don't know what to do with them. So often this process is simply everything that goes in should be sent to another group of people, because they will take care of it. But often you can actually make, create a small process that will help them do access control, do refresh problems, and if you have, your access is always given through Active Directory security groups, they don't even have to go into Power BI. It's the recommended way of doing things. So they can often do certain things, but sometimes they will just refer the rest somewhere else to your Power BI power users. tenant setting documentation. It's not a process in itself, but it's connected to a process. So your tenant settings need to be documented, because otherwise you don't know how they should be set. You need to go look through each and every tenant setting and say, I want this one to be like this, and I want to write it down how it is. And then you create a process around how to monitor that, because it has to be done manually. And then you will create a process also about how, if I need to change them, how do I do it? So it's basically an administration process that I think you should be doing.
Settings every day.
Well, yeah. So they change all the time, so it's really, really hard. I recommend once a month. I think Microsoft have been much better now at having them off when they get new settings in. So that helps a little bit. I'm running out of time, but it's last session of the day, so hopefully you're okay with me going a little bit on. So roles is another thing to it. I think you should be defining, and the main reason for it is that what I find when I go to customers is that a lot of people have these kind of roles, but they're not recognized as roles, so they don't have that. They are meant to do it, beside their normal job, and when they do that, they're not going to be doing it well. So it's just recognizing that these people actually need to spend time on their things, which I think is important. It doesn't have to be necessarily these, but these are the most obvious ones. And then the second last part of my governance strategy is monitoring, and of course it's the extremely important part. This is the what does it look like? So the other was how do I want it to look like? This is what does it actually look like? And I recommend you do it in 3 ways. You find out what exists, and hopefully maybe even with a trend over time, what people are doing, and then you enrich that a little bit with some extra information. So first of all, you should figure out what exists. And the reason why I think it's important to get the artifact inventory basically is that if you just take the log, it's very hard to get all the extra metadata about your workspaces, your reports, who owns it, when was it last updated, all these different things that can be seen in the artifact inventory. There is a new scanner API which you can use, or you can simply use the admin APIs to do it, and it has to be done with the APIs. Microsoft have been really good at giving us commandlets in PowerShell, so if you don't like to write web apps or write against the web endpoints in PowerShell, you can use those commandlets. Just be aware that those commandlets, they are created by Microsoft at a certain time. So if the API endpoint has changed over time, those commandlets might not necessarily change. A very vivid example of that is the get reports commandlet. So the reports commandlet will get you all the reports, but the API endpoint has been involved since the commandlet was created, and now gives you, for example, when the report was last updated and what day it was created. That is not in the commandlet because they haven't updated the commandlet. So keep that in mind. And of course the activity log, which is probably the main thing here in the monitoring. What are people doing? And it's very, very simple. It can be hard to get to in the Microsoft 365 Security and Compliance Center, where you have 90 days. But if you are a Power BI admin, it's very easy to get it in the Power BI admin REST API. Just get all the history you can get, then start collecting it every day, storing it somewhere safe. The tricky part with this is most often modeling it correctly, making sure that it's easy to read and understand, not getting it out. That's usually the simple one. But store it safely. You have to remember there are potentially sensitive data in the old one. Although it's all internal, so it's not that like you're having customer data in that, but at least it can be potentially sensitive. Another useful data that I think can be good to get is information about users, because in the audit log you will get the email, and you will get in some of the admin APIs you will only get a GUID, but in the Azure Active Directory you can get the actual name of the person, might even get the department and all the things like that if you are using that the functionality of Active Directory. And you can also get license information from Microsoft 365. So what I talked about before, if someone gets a license, you might send them the documentation saying, hey, now it's time to run because you have a license. You might do something like that. This is how I often do it. use the REST API, run it for Azure Function or Azure Data Factory, and then I store the files individually, and then I build the data model on top of that. But you might also just report on top of the JSON files that come up. Depends on what you want to do. The last part of it is training, and this is a very short one, so I will let you go in just a moment. You should train people in the tool, and you should train people in the governance. And you should train everyone, not just the developers, but also the end users. You can do that so that not everyone needs to sit in a classroom and do training, because end users, they can just maybe have 5-minute videos. There are 10 5-minute videos will tell them everything they need to know. So train them as well, because it's very beneficial. And then what I really love is to automate the offering. So as soon as you get a license, pro license, you get here's the documentation, here's everything you need to know. As soon as you build something for the first time, you can also do it at that time. So try to automate it as much as you can, so it's not just sitting, collecting dust. The documentation, the training material and all the documentation. So how do you implement this? I normally try to do an assessment first. What needs to be done? What are the gaps? Then I go through a process of interviewing people to create the processes. Discover the needs and restrictions, create the process, iterate it necessarily, and the same with monitoring. Choose the architecture, implement it, iterate if needed, and then training can be done in a million different ways. So this is just the way I like to approach the implementation. That was it. I'm sorry it was a bit fast, but hopefully you get it.